Now, I must tell you that I have very bad news for you. Oh God, she said. It has nothing to do with the exams. It's that I've been talking with my economist friends, and what they tell me is that you are inferior goods. And they even tell me that Yale students are probably among the most inferior of all goods. So, of course, put on my naive face and said, what are you talking about? And this is what I learned. So, you take, I hope I've learned to bring my, yes, good. So this is a standard economic kind of diagram, and what it shows is the amount of clothing that an individual buys. And if they're very poor, they buy at the Salvation Army store, and they spend very little bit, or they buy very few clothing. When they get rich, they go to Brooks Brothers and buy suits for $1,000, and that's probably an underestimate of what they actually spend. And so as their income increases, the amount that they spend or the number of things that they buy increases. All very standard kind of thing. The ratio, there's an extra little fill-up to this, not wildly important for this course, is how much this line increases for a particular change in income is called the elasticity, how big a change there is. And in clothing, you really don't need an awful lot of clothing to go on. But you can spend a lot on it. And I know myself that when I was a graduate student, I used to buy all my clothing at the Goodwill store. And now that I'm a professor, I have a little more income, and I don't buy so much at the Goodwill store. But it's still a great place to buy things. And I see the other graduate students know exactly what I'm talking about. But anyway, clothing has a big elasticity. But food, down here, you really can't eat that much more food. Now we try, of course, but we don't succeed. So no matter what your income is, certainly if you measure the food in pounds, you don't eat an awful lot more. If you measure it in dollars, you can buy caviar and live on caviar. But basically, there can be a high elasticity or low elasticity. Okay, so that's one of the clear and simple ideas of economics, and I'm sure it's nothing new to you. Now, can you think of a counterexample to this? Something that as people get richer, they buy less of. Spam. What? Spam. Good. Cheap food. That's a generation ago. Spam. How many of you have ever eaten Spam? You went to prep school or something, right? I have never eaten Spam. But McDonald's hamburgers are one of those kinds of things. And for people in a poor country, like rice, what do they go from what? Brown rice, unpolished rice is what the poor people eat, or in India, millet. And then when they get more money, they go to polished rice, or they go to wheat. That in all countries, food is one of the important things that you eat up higher on the food chain. You change what you want to eat depending on your income, and you can eat less of what you previously did. A lot of public transportation is another example of goods that you buy less of as you get richer. You take it, if you get richer, you take a taxi, or you have your own limousine and a chauffeur and so forth if you're really wealthy. So all of these things do the opposite thing to that. Economists have a word for that kind of a good, and it is inferior good. Okay. Now, what's another example of that? You guys. That one of the most robust phenomena in the world is this fact, that poor people have a lot of kids. Rich people have very few kids. This works no matter how you spin it. You can compare a poor country, like take any sub-Saharan Africa country that you want, to a rich country, take any European, American, Japanese country that you like. If this is income across countries, as they say cross-sectional, this is very, very true. If you look within a country, like pick any country, the rich people tend to have fewer children than the poor people. And also, you can spin it a third way. With time, if you look at when a country was poor, they'll be having a lot of children, and then as they develop economically and they get rich, they have fewer children. So this is an absolutely robust kind of data. One of them, yeah?
What if you measured value of children by investment per child?
We're going to get to that later. That's at the end of a lot of intermediate stuff. So, but this is the number of children that you get. It's not how much you're spending on them, but the number of children that you have. So you have these three different ways that you can have a high slope, a low slope, and the slope can even turn down. Whoops. This is some real data for, this is the total fertility rate, and going from 1 or even less up to 8 children. And this is the gross domestic product per adult, and this is the log of it because it goes over 6 orders of magnitude. That's some places earn an awful lot more. So there's not a linear scale, but a log scale. But over that whole range, you can see there's a very good correlation that those countries which have poor income have a lot of children, and those that have a lot of income have few children. And this is 2 different periods in time, 1960, which is really before the third world fertility transition, and 2000, when you're in the middle of the third world fertility transition. And you have these points for the 1960, the circles, the pluses for 2000, and you see what's happened is they've slid down this line. The countries have slid down this line. There's still pretty much the same relationship, but the countries progress and their income grows up. This is the regression line for 1960. This is the regression line for 2000. A small difference, hasn't changed very much. So again, this is really a very robust kind of thing. If you compare countries, a 10% increase in per capita income equates to a 13% decrease in fertility. And it's a very interesting thing. You have big culture differences between countries. Within a country where you're under more or less, if you have a homogeneous country, more or less the same culture, the freedom of people to change their fertility, to choose their fertility is much more limited within a culture. So now if you look only within a country, you get a much smaller change. A 10% increase in income correlates with only a 1% change in fertility. So it depends exactly how you run your statistics, how big an effect this is. But it's absolutely robust. We always find it. So here's a great term paper for you, or even a research paper for the summer or something. So it's usually, with this respect to the Yale students, it's usually presumed that the families of Yale students generally have a very good income. Probably even within, Yale tries to get a distribution of incomes, but within each class, we probably do very well. So we're a high income group. And it's probably also true that we generally have very few children, that your families probably each have very few children. So you can take a ratio of family income to number of children. And that ratio for different groups is probably a measure of how inferior you are, right? The higher the ratio, income to number of children, tells you how much parents don't want children because they have a lot of income. And guess who has this data? Where have you filled in this data? Admissions office. If you're applying for scholarship, which I think at least 3/4 of you apparently do, some sort of financial aid, they have income data on your family, and they also have the number of siblings in your family. All that is data that they have. So if you can get it out of admissions, you could really do some very interesting study of what is that ratio for Yale students. And then once it's published from Yale, every other school in the country is going to try to do it, and it'll do for different works. I haven't seen these kind of things published, that this ratio for various special socioeconomic groups. Okay. So this is kind of a surprising phenomenon that that rich people have fewer children. And one year I taught this course, and there was a guy in it, a somewhat older guy who was actually already a professor in Kenya, but he'd come to Yale for more education, and he took this course. And after the course, he told me that he was just blown away that he had never realized, coming from Kenya, that poor people had more children than rich people. Actually, he put it the other way. He had no idea that one of the aspects of being rich was that you have fewer children. He was a college professor or university professor in Kenya. So this is actually quite shocking. You heard, I mean, our whole cultural story is that parents love children, parents want children. Well, they want them, maybe they love them. Well, not when they're teenagers, of course. And so you'd expect that more income would be an enabling factor, a very big enabling factor, that you'd, in general, have more children. But it isn't the case. Well, this is anomalous things are of great interest to scientists, including social scientists, and so economists have, of course, paid a good amount of attention to this. And the way they talk about children is that they try to generalize, just the way scientists try to generalize things, make Newton's laws applies to everything, whereas before there were a lot of different things. So they try to use the same words they use for suits or food for children. And the kinds of things they say are that children are a time-intensive commodity. They take a lot of time to either enjoy or bring up properly. Women's value of time is a key component in the price of children, that children have a price like any other good. The time, this all quotes out of various recent articles. The time cost of children in other household production. Children are one of the things that households produce. Then they talk about the opportunity costs for households to produce and consume a child. I love the idea that what parents are doing is consuming you. And I will put on the web an article by Jonathan Swift, you know, the same guy who did Gulliver's Travels. You know this article. Yamada's proposal, exactly. And this is tongue-in-cheek in his part, but at that time, and much earlier, much later, the English were concerned about the Irish problem. The Irish were very poor, they had tons of kids, and they didn't like to be ruled by England. So the Irish problem had to be solved, and what Swift suggested was that the Irish eat their children. And what this would do, provide good food for them, a lot of protein and everything, so it would solve their starvation problem, and it would reduce the population problem there. So of course this was tongue-in-cheek, but it makes really interesting reading, and especially notice his use of, if you bother to read it, it's not required. His use of numbers, it's full of numbers. It's a real takeoff on what fairly contemporaneous people, like the people starting to write economics, were writing. Okay, so this idea that economics deals with children just as they do with any other commodity, it's the genius of economics to be able to do that, just as the genius of science to be able to make generalization. But it's also one of the reasons people reject the approach. People generally don't want to consider themselves commodities. So why should people want fewer children as they get richer? Well, the basis of essentially all modern economics is rational actor theory, that people act to maximize their happiness, or utility, or preferences. There's a lot of different jargon words with slightly different meanings, and they don't act against their self-interests. Now there's new psychological economics, or neural economics, which finds out this isn't really true, but it doesn't matter. Most theory depends on rational actor theory. And so economists believe that people decide what to do based on a calculation. It doesn't necessarily have to be a conscious calculation, which little problem there, of what's good for them, and they act that way. So somehow economists have to figure out, why is it good for people who have money to have fewer children? What is in their self-interest? And actually, a guy wrote a paper, Gary Becker, in 1960, and then he got a Nobel Prize for this, for bringing what they call family economics into the mainstream of economics and treating children like any other good. And some of what I'm going to tell you really comes from Becker's theory. So, as I mentioned, one of the fundamental ideas is that it costs money to rear children, and so they can be considered an item to be purchased. And so they call them a good. Anything that you purchase is called a good. So children there's different kinds of goods, and children are, all of them, or at least most of them. One, they're a production good, like a machine. A production good is something like you buy a machine for a factory to do work. And children, of course, especially in poor settings, do various kinds of work. We'll come back to each of these things. They're a consumption good. A consumption good is something you buy and maybe eventually use up, but you enjoy it. You buy it because you get pleasure in some sense out of having that, not because it does work for you. And the third thing is they can be an investment good, that you put money into a child when they're young, and then when they're older you get something back for it. The return, just like putting money in a bond, you put it in and then you wait some time and you get presumably more back. So first consider children as a production good, which is very largely the case in poor countries. One thing that's pretty obvious is a child does not cost much to make. It's pretty cheap. And in a peasant family, children do a lot of work for the family. They can run errands, they collect firewood, they can fetch water, they take care of younger children, they weed the fields. There's a whole bunch of things that children will do. And you have some readings on that in today's readings. And they actually do a lot of work. Here's an example of little Boz, the name of a kid, can run all over, fetch up cows out of the stock fields, or oxen, carry in stove wood and climb in the corn crib and feed the hogs, and go on errands down at his grandma's. Guess where that description comes from? Could be anywhere in the world. It happens to be Kansas settler in the late 1800s. So in America, like other places in the farm economy, kids do an awful lot of work. There's a saying from Indonesia that by age 7, a child does more work for the family than the family has to do for it. To study that, sociologists, anthropologists, economists actually go out in the field and observe in peasant societies, and the professor or graduate student stays with the family or stays in the same village with the family and always carries around a clipboard. They have these clipboards. And what they do is they write down everything that the parents do for the children and everything that the children do for the parents. Mom is cooking. Sister is washing vegetables. Little brother is sent to the neighbors for a bit of cooking oil. Baby just defecated. Yep, mom stops cooking to clean up the baby, et cetera, et cetera. You can imagine all this down on a clipboard. That's when a child is young. The family puts a lot of work into the child. As the child gets older, they require less and less from the family, and they start doing more work for the family. And so economists, you can calculate, or anthropologists, anybody can calculate a crossover age. What is the age at which children do more work for the family, measured, say, in hours, than the family does work for the children? It's no longer quite as young as the 7 that the Indonesians talked about, but modern calculations show it's something like at age 13, children are doing more work in an agrarian society, children doing more work for the family than the family puts in to them. In your reading packet is a story about Tanamani from Malaysia, and every year students understand it's a wonderful story, you'll love it, why did I put that in? And of course it's child labor. It shows you how exactly, a little bit unusual instance, but how children are viewed is not romantic at all, it's a straight economic calculation. You maximize the amount of work that you get out of a child. Jonathan Swift, I think, mentions age 6 as the age when children can begin earning money as pickpockets. And David Copperfield was sent to work apparently at the age of 10, and Charles Dickens himself went to work at the age of 12. Currently, calculations from the United Nations International Labor Organization shows that there's something like 250 million children, age 5 to 14, that are employed, and half of these children are employed full-time, not as casual laborers, but as full-time. And this estimate, this is not a decreasing phenomenon, but this estimate is up from earlier ones of 73 million children. So from 73 to 250 million. Child labor is apparently increasing quite significantly in the world. So in agrarian societies, just from the work that children do, children can be an economic benefit, and so people want a lot of them to work around the farm. And even in the early stages of industrialization, children are often sent into earning work, or they earn cash, and in real poverty situations in industrially developing countries, even the small wages of children can make a sort of life and death difference in the survival of the family. But notice that this all changes now when modernization comes in. One of the things that happens is children go to school. And if they go to school, they have fewer hours to work at home. So their costs, their benefits goes down. Money has to be provided for tuition, for books, for clothing or uniforms, for shoes. Children on the farm often don't have shoes, but when they go into the city to be proper, they usually have to have shoes. So their costs go up. Their benefit goes down, their cost goes up. Another aspect of modernization, medicine becomes available. Now if a child gets sick, the parents have to spend money on doctors or on medicine, or they perceive that they have to do such a thing. If the family's in the city, and there gets to be a lot of children working, but there are also a lot of adults out of work, the government eventually puts in child labor laws and says children can't work, and it makes it illegal, and therefore children can't work at all. Their benefit goes down. So all of these things act to reduce the value of children as production goods. They're just not as good a production good as they used to be. Now consider children as a consumption good. Again, that's the pleasure that, or fulfillment that parents get out of having children. One article I read talks about children as a consumer durable. That's because they last a long time. And they're like refrigerators. They last a long time. They're a durable good. And you see the reports every month of how many more or less durable goods are being bought. So it's very interesting because the purchase of durable goods, you don't usually pay cash for that. They go in a credit card and an easy payment plan for later payment. And it's the same for children. They don't cost anything, they don't cost much to make, and the costs come later. I'm thinking the child is kind of like a house. If you're poor, or you can or could, until the recent debacle, buy a house with no money down. You don't have any money, and then you get a mortgage, and it's later on, after you have the house, that you have to every year pay off the mortgage. You've got to maintain the house, insurance for the house, taxes for the houses. That the upfront cost is very small later. And as you know, a lot of people enjoy shopping very much. And then once they choose, they say, this is what I want. They go to get a big bang out of the actual purchase. And making children is very similar. People enjoy the foreplay, and then they get a big bang. Well, that didn't work very well. Okay. So another aspect, finally got it. Another aspect of this is children as consumption goods, and this has to do with modernization, is that you can't consider goods separately, one from the other. People have a certain amount of money, and what they buy will depend not only on the cost of each individual good, but on their relative costs. And so what happens when a country modernizes with respect to children is that the cost of children is perceived to go up. That education, health, all these clothing, all these costs go up inexorably. Where at the same time, the cost of manufactured items goes down. Radio players, television, any of the goodies that you spend an awful lot of time with. As time goes on, technology improves, the cost of those goes down. So modernization increases not only the absolute cost of children, but even more intensely, the relative costs. because as their costs go up, costs of other things that people want go down. So that's another cause why people might want fewer children as time goes on. Another aspect is the time cost of children. An important idea is that people have not only limited income, which they can spend as they choose, but also a limited amount of time. And we all use the phrase of spend their time, and economists take that as a serious issue, and they think that time is spent in a rational manner. Time can be used for leisure, time can be used for parenting, or if the person works, time can be money. It can be used to work and earn money. And each person has to balance, or each family has to balance these things. Most of the time, and I'll show you some data on this, required for child rearing is spent by the mother. In fact, almost exclusively in most societies, the mother does basically all the work. In a peasant society, the mother does all the housework. Everything at home is generally done by the mother, and this time is not valued at all. Mostly in peasant cultures, women's work at home doesn't count. She and the children may go out into the fields and do an awful lot of work weeding and everything, and also again culturally this usually just doesn't count. So women's time is not particularly valued in traditional societies. And in traditional time, she can't get a job, so she's not going to be able to there are just no jobs available for her. But then modernization comes in, and jobs become available in the cash economy. And cash is what people value. Cash in an agrarian society is so rare, so difficult to come by, that's what is really valued. Jobs become available, and in many industrializing situations, and especially in the third world now, the first jobs that become available are low-skilled jobs like sewing. But almost every country that enters into the modern world has started its, quote, industrial revolution by sewing jobs in factories. Bangladesh, Indonesia, all over the world, sewing is the first kind of thing, and this is largely a women's job. And you see this in China, all over the world, that some of the earliest jobs in the modern sector are for women. Assembly, you look at pictures of assembly lines, and almost any electronic goods, who's doing the assembly? Very largely women are doing it. So once job opportunities become available, then you set up a competition between childbearing and working. Childbearing, the woman is at home, she can't be out in the city working, and her time is spent taking care of the children, and therefore she doesn't earn an income. Or she can have fewer children or no children and go to work and earn income. So what happens is the opportunity cost to women, which was considered essentially zero in traditional times, starts rising. As jobs become available for women, the opportunity cost of having children rises. So that's another thing that as modernization proceeds, you might expect that families want fewer children. As modernization proceeds, people get richer, and all of these effects might really not be due to the income, but just time going on in the way that I've been talking about, the changes that modernization brings. Now, the third kind of thing we have to consider for children is to consider them as an investment good. That means you pay now, you get a return later. And of course, the value of children doesn't stop once they grow up. If the culture has strong families, and that's a very important if, then the children, when they grow up, will perceive that they have a responsibility toward the parents, and that they have a responsibility to support the parents in old age or even before old age. And it's interesting to note that if there's no stock market in a country or banks, and poor people really don't have access to these things in most places at the earliest stage of industrialization, there's nothing else for people to invest in. There's just no market for things. There's no market for their savings because rats and insects eat up an awful lot of food. You can't really store the food. So basically, almost the only mode of investment is in children. So children are indeed, in pre-modern societies, very much an investment good. And this is brought home, I mean, I read a lot about this, but the experience of it in the developing country is very interesting to hear. So we had a graduate student, he was from India, and he was from an upper class family, his family had only a few children, and all his relatives, his whole class, the people he really knew, had already done their fertility transition and had very few children. But he was a good-hearted soul and wanted to help poor people. So he worked, before he came to Yale, he worked in an adult literacy program, and that's really one of the best things that you can do. And this particular program was aimed at the very poorest people who were still illiterate. And in the course, they discussed everything, because you need vocabulary, you need to discuss. So there's a lot of discussion as well as reading. And one of the things they discussed was family planning. In fact, Anand had been speaking in the class strongly in favor of family planning, trying to convince them that they shouldn't have so many children, that they would be better off with fewer children, which was the experience of his social class. But one day, one of the adults took Anand, this guy, aside and said, "You know, you are wrong about family planning. I have no money to save for retirement. There's no Social Security. The government won't care for me in old age. I need a son to care for me in old age. I have 10 children. If even one of them survives and becomes successful, then I will be lucky and have a comfortable old age." So that was very nicely put, what the man said to Anand. But it's also Anand's reaction was also very interesting, that even though he grew up in India, he had never thought about that before. He'd never heard about it, he'd never thought about it, he never perceived it from the point of view of a poor person. And he was very impressed. And when he told me this story, what he said, he was amazed at how compelling the argument was, and he couldn't think of anything to say back to the person in support of his previous views. So, again, for the very poorest people, about the only strategy they have for old age is to have children who will take care of them, and in most cultures that means a son who will take care of them. Kids cost very little in a poverty-stricken culture. They wear hand-me-down clothes. They don't have toys or lots of anything like that. They get basically no school or medical care. The kind of food that poor people eat is fairly cheap. And interesting in terms of time, beyond the first child, if you have the first, second child, as soon as they get up to be 5, 6, 7, they start taking care of the younger children. So the time burden on the mother sort of goes away. Once you have somewhat older children, and older means like 5, they can start strapping the baby on their back and going around with the baby, so that extra children don't even cost much time for the parents. They cost very little money. You already have all the hand-me-down things, so it's just a subsistence amount of cheap food that the child needs. So children are very small cost, and their benefit as old age insurance is perceived to be quite great. Okay, but what happens as modernization, so parents are basically willing, poor parents are willing to invest a little bit that they have and a little bit that's needed in a lot of children. How does modernization affect this investment? If jobs start to be available in the cities and or possibilities open up for migration abroad to jobs, all the people from India and Pakistan that go to the Middle East to work in oil-related jobs, the rich economies there, or people that come to America to find jobs. They all send back remittances. At least the first generation is very good about sending back remittances, which is a huge fraction of poor people's income. And even though the remittances may not be a huge fraction of what they're earning in America or in Saudi Arabia, in terms of the income that their parents are living on, in poverty-stricken, it can be a very big increment to their income. And so children can be a really good investment. If they can get a job in the city or get a job abroad, they're a really good investment. And that's modernization. Increases everything else, it decreases the value of children, but modernization increases their value, this aspect of their value, as an investment. Several other things happen during modernization that increase the value investment. First of all, child mortality. The first thing in a demographic transition, or usually the first thing that happens, is a quite severe drop in infant mortality. And what that means is children are now likely to grow up. That previously children died very young or died various times in their young ages. And if something is going to disappear, like if something is going to get stolen from you, you don't try to buy a really fancy car if you're pretty sure it's going to get stolen. And it's the same thing with children. If the odds are very high that your children are going to die, it's really not, and if the modern medicine isn't available, it's not really a good idea to put a lot of investment into a child that's going to die. But as modernization, some ideas of sanitation, public health come into play, and the expectation that children will live increases, then there's a longer period for them to live and return income to the parents. The other side of the coin is pretty much the same. The parents are living longer. So in the old style of fertility, married people just kept having children until they became sterile at 45 or something like that. And then at the old life expectancy, they didn't have much longer to live. So, and they were still capable of working at 40, 45, and then they die. So even if they have children that stay alive, there's not a long period of dependency where they'll get income from their children. So and if you have your last child at, say, 40 or 45, then they're going to reach maturity when you're 60 or something, almost 60. And that's at or above the life expectancy in very poor countries. So the increased longevity of both children and parents make it a much better deal to have children as an investment good, because there's a longer time they can pay you, and you're going to be around for a longer time to get this. So, as opposed to the other ways that children are looked at economically, as an investment good, modernization can massively increase the value of children. So that would be, so we have counterbalancing. If people have more money as modernization goes on, you think they could afford more children, but they become less good as consumption goods. They become less good as production goods, but they become much better as investment goods. And of course, as people have more money, they have more money that they can save, and one of the ways they save it is by investing it in the children. So one of the issues then is, okay, if the value of children is now mostly as an investment good, how do you maximize this investment? In agrarian societies, there are really no opportunities outside farming. That's what the society does, period, we're done. If indeed the agriculture is traditional, you're doing it exactly the way your grandfather did it and his grandfather did it. And that's a very safe way to farm, because you're on the edge of survival. If your crop doesn't grow, you're in big trouble. So if you try something new, there's always a danger that it might not work. If you do something the way it's been done for hundreds of years or thousands of years, or you perceive as thousands of years in your family on your land, you're pretty sure that it's going to work. You may not get an awful lot out of it, but it's sure it's going to work. So peasants are very conservative, not only about their production, their agricultural production, but everything else in their life, because they don't have anything extra to gamble with. So they're not going to take on anything new. And the old way of doing it, father passes it on to son, exactly has been doing it. You don't need an education to do farming in a traditional kind of way. You learn it while doing with your father. But when education gets modernized, when agriculture gets modernized, there's fertilizers, there's new varieties of seeds, you have to pay attention to money. When you enter into the market economy, you have to have some mathematical abilities to know about money. You may have to borrow money, there's interest rates, there's payback schedules, there's all kinds of things, so that education starts becoming very valuable, even in agriculture. And so early on, the combination of not needing education and the probability that kids will die young, there's really not much benefit in investing in education in an early agricultural society. So the best strategy at that time is to have a lot of children and put a minimal investment in each of them, and hope that some of them don't die. And that's in fact empirically true, that the investment before the demographic transition, the investment that people put into their children, each child, was indeed very small. And subsistence carried on the way it always was. But now population increases because foreign foods come in, all kinds of things happen, and population starts increasing, land becomes scarce. And now imagine you have a small farm and you yourself are living as a subsistence farmer, and you've got a whole bunch of kids, and now you're faced with dividing up your land among the kids. Well, you know the kids aren't going to be able to do it. You can barely do it on your size farm. If you divide it up among 2, 3 or so sons, it just ain't going to work. So you're in crisis. And when the kids inherit such a little bit of land, not only are they going to have big trouble, but they're not going to have any excess to provide for you. So children, if they stay in the farm economy, stop becoming any kind of a decent investment to keep you going when you're getting a little old. So you've got to figure out what to do. You're facing the crisis. But the outside economy is modernizing. You may not be modernizing, but the outside economy is modernizing, and jobs become available, largely jobs that require some sort of education. White-collar jobs, the government jobs, are big, huge bureaucracies spring up. I'll mention that a little bit. And parents rather rapidly realize that the only option is for the kids to go to the city and get a job, but there's all the parents, everybody reaches that state pretty much at the same time, so the cities are just flooded with people coming in looking for the still scarce jobs. How do you have an edge up? It has to be education. That the only way you can get these white-collar jobs absolutely need an education. In manufacturing jobs, you do better. You have to deal with machinery. You have to know things about machinery. I was in Peru quite a ways back, and they took peasants off the Altiplano, this high, dry plain where there's no water and the land is terrible, and they live on about $1 a day. And in order to get a job in the mines, the first job is you take a shovel and you shovel, there's big machines that eat away at the rock face, but a lot of it drops down, and you need people with shovels to get the rest of it and dump it into the truck. So this is really a minimum skill labor job. But they needed to have two things, which not everyone had. One, to know that machines can be dangerous, that they can get hot from spinning around, that they can be electrified, that you don't just touch something unless you know what's going on. And the second thing, you have to know enough about time to get to the job on time every day. The shift comes on, you've got to be there. And the peasants don't come knowing those sorts of things. And those that do know those things can double their income to like $2 a day if they can get jobs in. So that's even the most basic kind of job requires a kind of mindset and educational thing that you don't get generally on a farm. So education becomes an extremely valuable commodity. And so in order to get the job and to stay alive, kids have to be healthy. So you also have to put money into education, and you have to put money into health for the kids. That's the prerequisite to have. If you have a bond, like your kid, you got to have a safe deposit box for it. That's like health insurance or health care for it. And otherwise, it's going to disappear on you. So this investment in children, which in education and health care, becomes a very good deal. That if you can manage to invest that much in your child, they can go to the city or go abroad, get a good job, and their income will be so much more than yours that they can send you back a significant amount. These investments in children are called human capital. The result of them is called human capital. It's the health and education of the population. And it's now realized that when economists study, why is one country rich and one country poor? Well, part of it is their stock of physical capital. Physical capital is the factories, the machines, the buildings, all the stuff that you can knock on. But they've realized that that's not the biggest difference. The biggest difference is what they call human capital, how educated and how healthy the population is. So it's a very big thing. And so an interesting thing, we have two different factors that are now in play why a child becomes a good investment good. One, with education, they can get a higher paying job, and with better health, they can live longer and the parents can live longer. So they're paying you back not only at a higher rate if they're educated and healthy, but for a longer time period. So we normally think that things add. Well, you get a certain benefit from their education, earning more per year, and you get a certain benefit from their health, they're living longer, and you might be tempted to add those two, but in fact they multiply. That you're getting a certain extra amount per year over 30 years or something like that, so the two factors multiply. And that's one of the really big things in Becker's theory, is how these factors that go into the income that a child will bring in, the health and the education, multiply with each other. And so even fairly small increments in either one lead to a very big return. Multiplication is a very large effect. So the end of this, that as an investment good, investment in children's health and education is very rewarding. It's a really rewarding kind of investment in the kind of economic situation that we've been discussing. But here's the catch, that if you're poor, you can't make these investments in a whole lot of children. And so the best strategy, instead of having a lot of children and dividing up your assets among a bunch of them, you have a very few children and you concentrate your assets, you concentrate what you can invest in a few children, and you get them fairly good health care and as good an education as you can get for it. Children that have these two things, it's called the quality of the child. Again, that's another economic jargon term, that the health and education of the child are the quality of the child. And the way this change that goes on in the demographic transition is called the switch or the trade-off from quantity to quality. Before the transition, parents want a lot of children because the main thing they're worried about is the probability that they're just going to die, and there's nothing the parents can do about that. The local folk medicine is almost totally ineffective, so the kids are just going to die kind of randomly. But as time goes on, that's not true anymore. They can do something to keep their kids alive, and they get the kids educated so that they can earn a good rate of income. And so there's this this switch from wanting quantity to wanting quality in the children. And parents catch on to this very quickly. Some of the very rapidity of some of the third world fertility declines has been due to that. When the land gets filled up by people, it becomes very obvious right away that you've got to do something. And the only thing available are jobs in the cities, and they know very well that the kids need education to compete in that job market. So, in terms of policy, you get some really interesting kind of conundrums. So one is, education is what the people want. They want it desperately. And yet, if they keep having 8 children, the country is going to be hopeless. So policymakers like the idea that in order to get an education, people have to reduce their fertility, but they also, as with good hearts, want to make education free. So the question in a developing country is, how much to charge for education is a very, very major issue, because you need to strike a balance between allowing, setting the price low enough so that you can get a lot of your children educated, yet setting some price so that it's an incentive to parents to not just absolutely flood the system and overwhelm everything. And wherever you set this, parents will always use strategies to maximize their benefit. And one of the kind of strategies that people worry about that parents can do is have the first child stays at home Second child stays at home. Eventually that child grows up and starts doing work, and then they can do the work around the house that's needed in weeding the fields and the work on the farm. Your third child is now in a sense surplus. You don't need their labor. If there's free education, you get them educated, send them to the city. And you can do that. If there's no cost to getting a child educated, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, there's no limit to the number of children that you can have. You send them all off to the city, they send you back money. Same with health care, that if you have a welfare government and it doesn't set this just right, if health care is also free or nearly free, then again, there's no cost to having the extra children. People may continue to have that many children, and then the whole system just gets flooded and you have a failed experiment. So, education and healthcare are some of the fundamental variables in this relationship between economic development, jobs becoming available, and how many children that you have. And in developing countries, as you know, there's a lot of people, labor is cheap, but capital is scarce. They're not rich. They don't have a lot to invest in factories and everything. So it's hard for them to build a steel plant or a petrochemical plant. That takes a lot of bucks and a lot of know-how. But what about producing a teacher? Is that an expensive or a cheap proposition? Teaching is labor intensive. It's not capital intensive. You need maybe a chalkboard and some chalk, and some places don't even have that. And so education is being labor intensive is one of the cheap things that countries can do. So basically even the poorest country can have a surplus labor, largely female, and give it a minimum amount of training. All you have to do is make them basically literate, and they can go out into the villages and teach children to read and to write, which is an amazing progress, and then that bootstraps itself. And if you look at developing countries, that's one of the things they really invest in is first primary education, and they get a big return from that. They have the finances to do that. And in fact, almost all developing countries also have a pretty good university structure, not a research level university, but a teaching university. So if you look at places, they're producing doctors. I don't know if you know this, but in America, something like half of all the doctors that get licensed are trained abroad. Now some of them, England, Sweden, Germany, are trained pretty much the way we are, but they're coming in from India, Pakistan, Philippines, places like that. And the people are just as smart as anywhere else. They're maybe work harder, more ambitious. Maybe it's harder even to get into. But they can train thousands and thousands of doctors, and a medical school class in Mexico City will be like 3,000 students or something. The law classes are all very, very huge because it's cheap, and the marginal cost, if you already have a class in physiology with somebody lecturing, add another 100 students doesn't cost you anything. So education up to very high levels is something that developing countries can often afford because it's a labor-intensive occupation. And when you think of the brain drain, what happens then is you get more doctors than India can support, more doctors than Mexico can support, so they want to come to the United States. You get the brain drain, that the most highly educated people from all these developing countries, which the government has invested in to pay for their education, they go to England, they go to America, they go to France, they go to Japan if they're allowed in, and they get a job. So that's the old style brain drain where the people physically move to here. But it's also the modern job flight that now, again, as I said, with the internet and cheap shipping costs, all these jobs can stay in India or somewhere, and we ship the jobs out, the accounting. So accounting is done in the daytime, banks do all the kind of transactions, they ship all that data overnight to India, and during our night, which is India's day, the Indian accountants work on it, and by the morning you have all your accounts settled. Engineering is worked on in Chicago during the day, and then however far the plans have got is shipped off to, again, usually India, and the architects there work on it and ship back to Chicago. And that's increasing. And so one of the important factors in this is basically the cheapness of education. That education, labor-intensive operation, and so developing countries can do it quite well. But within the developing countries, they can rather rapidly produce a lot of, say, college-educated people, and these people expect good jobs. You know, they've risen up by maybe by great amount of effort, risen up from the utter poverty in their villages, and now they have a college education and they're ready for a job. But the country usually doesn't have jobs for them. The economy is not yet developed. So what is there's a tremendous demand for white-collar jobs, and if they don't get these white-collar jobs, there are tremendous unrest among the young, educated people. They're very verbal. They know each other. They know how to communicate. They're mobile. You can have a very unstable political situation develop right away. So the governments in all these places almost always respond with government jobs. Since the private sector is not yet capable of producing jobs, there's government jobs. And you get these enormously bloated bureaucracies in almost every underdeveloped country where to do the tiniest little thing you need 16 different people to stamp it and sign it and approve it, and it takes 3 days for each of these people to make a decision. And so that's sort of things get out of whack when, because it's cheap, you can produce a lot of education, but then you can't get them jobs. And then once you establish these big bureaucracies, then further economic development may become difficult, because to do the slightest thing, build a factory or do something new or import something, you have to go through all this bureaucracy. And because the government doesn't have money to pay these people, you know, they get paid very poorly, so corruption. They can, you know, if you give a very small bribe, this is a wonderful thing for the bureaucrat. So he'll pay attention to your thing and only take 2 days instead of 3 days to approve whatever it is you've given him. So again, this is the problems of the relationship with demography and international and economic development in poor countries. It's all these interlocking things. The demography always interlocks with every other aspect of your economic development. Okay, so in terms of the whole picture of the change in the world, probably this is the kind of sequence. We've talked about a lot of different factors that happen to bring people into modernity. And so I want to sort of summarize a lot of that. The first thing that apparently happens, it starts in the Renaissance in the West and then continues on into the Enlightenment and then the Industrial Revolution, is that the first thing that happens is people stop thinking supernaturally about things and start thinking about the real world and trying to think rationally about it. So technological progress ensues and allows them better shipping, better navigation. They get all the way to America, discover American foods, bring them back, and start a population increase in Europe. Good ways to prevent disease are discovered. Industrial revolution increases productivity. You start thinking rational about things and everything can get better. More food means less death, and so population increases, and this starts in the 1700s in Europe and really starts, say, 1900s in the currently developing countries. And we saw before that sometime, you know, that the relationship between mortality drop and fertility drop was not a given, but in almost all cases, whether they went in parallel, that mortality was below fertility. So since early time, population has been increasing, and even in a still agrarian society, that means as population increases, the pressure on the land is going to go up, and you're going to get tinier and tinier plots until you reach a crisis. Now some places, remember what a surprise we had that England, which was industrially advanced, its urbanization was advanced, its education was advanced, everything was advanced, but it had one of the latest fertility transitions. Why? Maybe because of primogeniture, that they didn't have that kind of pressure on the land because only the oldest son inherited, and the land plots did not get smaller and smaller. And the political structure was such that the landed gentry were the ones that controlled parliament, and the cities really didn't count that much where the excess people were. So England did not experience the same kind of tiny and tiny pots and the vast amounts of rural poverty that other places had. So anyway, with the scarcity of land, the plots get smaller, And in most places, huge numbers of people fall into this abject kind of rural poverty. And then the two things that I've talked about today, one of the things I've talked about today happens next. First, individual families have to figure out a new strategy. They realize that education for kids is the only way out of their situation, and that means that they have to have fewer children. At the same time, with respect to the currently developing countries, the Western governments, either out of the goodness of their heart or because they're scared about revolution and communism and anti-Americanism, they have to help the third world. So they start supporting family planning programs. And what they do is two things. One, they, by advertising and just setting up limits, the social, the cultural acceptability of controlling fertility by some sort of contraception becomes acceptable. It's not anymore a totally taboo topic. And then they actually provide the goods themselves. So it allows people to work. Their economic interest is in having fewer children, but if there's not the contraceptives available, as say in China, there was for a long time, or it's not culturally acceptable, they can't act on that desire. The family planning programs come in, either government ones or foreign supported ones, their own government supported ones or foreign ones, supported ones, and that allows people to act on their desires to have fewer children. Then fertility falls because they're now using some sort of contraception, and then as we saw, I guess last lecture, that when fertility falls, then you get this bulge of workers and then the economy takes off. So that's kind of a way of putting the whole thing together. Now, this is all very nice theory that I proposed to you. You notice there are not too many data slides that I put up for this. It sounds great. I'm sure you're all convinced, yeah, that's a good answer. When you start looking at this in more detail, things don't turn out to be so convincing. One about the cost of children going up, which is the first part with children as a consumption good. Well, what do children actually need? They need some clothing, they need some food. That's basically what they need to stay alive. And that's all that they got in the old days. Well, what's happened to the price of clothing in the last several decades? No, price of clothing has fallen tremendously. Clothing with the new fabrics, you can't wear it out, first of all. I have that problem. I can't throw things away, so my clothes is just rolled. It's very cheap. It's made in China, Bangladesh. All around the world, the price of clothing has dropped tremendously as a fraction of income. You always have to do that as a fraction of income. The price of food has dropped around the world as a fraction of income. So the basic necessities of children have really dropped in price, and dropped quite drastically. When you see a graph of that, it's quite drastic. So if you consider the cost of providing the same goods that pre-transition people provided for their kids, if the cost of providing that now has gone way down as a fraction of income. And as I said, usually education is provided free by the government, and sometimes healthcare is provided free by the government. So it doesn't look like an economic issue that if you want to just have kids the way you used to have them, the cost has not risen, but the cost has gone down. But what has changed is in the minds of people, they now perceive that they must provide for their children a completely different and expanded set of goods than previously. Children have to have kind of education that they never had before. They have to have enrichment activities, all kinds of stuff. And if you read about China, I mean, it's amazing what Chinese, they have only one child, and that child is so overprogrammed it makes you look lazy. I mean, they go to dancing lessons and music lessons and English lessons, all after school. The kid is just working like crazy. You may have noticed near the beginning, but not at the beginning of the previous lecture, a whole bunch of Chinese came in and sat over there. They were the presidents of the student, I didn't know who they were. They turned out to be the presidents of the student associations at some of the really big universities in China. So these are, to get to be a top dog in a huge university is a big deal. And what were they interested in? This issue of modernization, that they're spoiled. They realize that. They were telling me, I spoke to them later, that they didn't want to have a sibling. They were really enjoying getting everything as an only child. They did not want a sibling. She's laughing because you know that story. But also the other side of the coin is, as the only child, they have to succeed. They have to get top grades in their education, so the amount of pressure on them to work like crazy all the time, to study, is severe. And they were interested in, largely in the pressures on them, which they were feeling. I guess as presidents of their student bodies, they're probably overachievers like crazy. And so they would feel this pressure enormously. And then you hear other stories where kids learn to play this game. So if a parent wants them, oh, why don't you wash the dishes tonight or help around the house? Oh, if I take time away from my studying, I'll fail my course. So it's this change in mentality that has raised the cost of childbearing. It's not the actual the actual cost of child raising. If you raise them the old way, that went way down. But there's been a culture change that's required an enormous increase in the expenditures on children. And of course, nowadays for you, parents don't expect probably anything from you in return as an investment. And just to pay 1 year of Yale is probably more than some Chinese might make in their whole life. Okay. Now, opportunity cost is another interesting thing. We talked about the mother's time. So as you remember, the cost of children is not just what you spend in cash, but it's the opportunity cost of childcare time. That if you're out doing childcare, you don't have the option to also work at that. And studies have shown that it's actually the time cost of children that way outweighs the direct cost of buying things for them. And 70% of the cost of a child is in the value of the time spent on it. So as people get richer, yes, they buy more for their children and they buy more expensive things, but their earning power also rises. So, and it's this rise in earning power that makes the 70%, so the 70% of the cost of children is the time they're not spending working. But when the people go out and do these time study things, I don't know how well you can see this, but this is the amount of time that a mother spends in childcare for her children. And as one children, it's 2.2 hours a day. And even up to 6, when they have 5 to 6 children, the wife is not employed, so there's a stay-at-home mom, it's 1.9 hours. There's really no significant difference depending on the number of children that you have. This is upstate New York in I think the 1950s. This is fairly recent. This is not even a developing country. The amount of time spent is actually quite small. Now compare this to the mother getting a job. She's, so people work 40 hours a week, say if it's 9 to 5, and if they don't get paid for the half hour of lunch, they work 8 hours a day, and depending on how you do lunch, it can be 8.5 or 9 hours. And then they have to commute, and maybe half an hour to work and half an hour back with getting properly dressed for the job and commuting and actually getting there. So we're talking 9-10 hours a day that a working mother in this case, but it could be a father, is away from home. So that's the cost of having a job, is like 10 hours. The cost of having any number of children, I mean, it's 7 to 9, something different is going on, and it's only about 2 hours a day. So the cost in time of children is not really all that great. And the only time it gets bigger is if the child is less than 1 year old, which it takes 3 or 4 hours a day to take care of a child. Now, this is for all the members of the family. This is just the mother. This is all members of the family. So again, now this is 2.7. Compare that to they have 1 child. It's a half an hour. The other members of the family together put a half an hour into the child is 2.3. This is a little bigger, but it's never more than an hour a day put into the child for all the other things. And again, it doesn't change an awful lot with a lot of children. Later children are cheap because there's basically little incremental cost to them. Here's more recent data, and this, the red line here is mother's child care, and this is per week. This is not per day. So it's something starts out in the 60s and 70s, which is comparable to the data you just saw. It was 9, 10 hours a week, which is just a little bit over an hour a day. And time goes on, I'll talk about that later. It increases, but it's very small. And here's the father's housework. It's like 2.5 hours a day. So it's not, so the amount of time it takes to deal with children, although our myth is that it's very, very time consuming. In actual fact, when you take the data, it doesn't really work out that way. And now, you have to be careful. This is extra time. So this, if you do housework, these numbers are extra time. So even if you have no children, it takes a certain amount of time to take care of a house. So that's a fixed thing. And then all these numbers ask how much extra time you're spending if you have children. So it compares people without children to people with children. And of course, that's the proper number that we want. And okay, so here is an interesting thing. So as this data gets more sophisticated, you say, well, what does child care mean? One, you can take no children and compare it to people with children. But if you look differently at what the mother is actually doing, sometimes it's her primary activity. She's actually doing the child, not really doing, if anything else she's doing, it's secondary, like watching TV or washing the dish, something. No, that's primary. And that's an hour and a half a day. If it's primary or secondary, so she may be washing the dishes or vacuuming and the kid is right there and she's talking to the kid and playing with it a little bit, it goes up a little bit. But it's still, this is pretty much the same number you see in the two previous slides, that there's a couple hours a day. This is again per day, and the other slide was per week. If you just count the time they're with the children at all, they can both be watching television together or they're not really doing childcare, they're just with the children, it's still, it gets to be more significant. But this is not time taken away from anything else, that just the child happens to be there. Now, and this is moderately stable. It doesn't change between 65 and 98, about the same, a little bit different, about the same. Now there's something interesting that you might have missed in the slides. I know I've got to stop in a minute. What happens between 1965 and 1998, or in the previous graph between 1965 and 2003? Women go to work. There's a huge difference in the number of women, the fraction, either both the number and the fraction of women working between any of these ages. And yet what do you see? The amount of time that the mother spends in childcare goes up from, during this period, 9 to 10 hours up to like 14 hours. That as women go to work, they spend more time with their children. Part of the answer to that is this is in the rest of house care, non-child house care. And with modern gadgets and throwaway stuff, that amount has allowed women to spend more time with children. So again, all this goes to contradict that part of the economic theory that says that child care competes with working. And the evidence is very, very skinny on that hypothesis. And in fact, if you ask your mothers or any woman that has children, what goes away when they go to work? Not child care, leisure time and sleep. Survey after survey says that what women do differently when they work is they get less sleep and less leisure time. So I guess that's all we can do today. So see you Thursday. We may not continue on this topic. I think you get the idea.